Before beginning, I'm going to take a deep breath to cut my nerves, and I'd like to invite all of you to follow suit. On one condition though, don't exhale. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, now breathe in again. Don't exhale. One more time. All right, you can exhale. I would really like to pass today, don't know CPR. My name is Erik Caswell, and I wrote a book for my senior project. And I'm sure you're sitting there a little out of breath, a little perplexed, and definitely wondering how those two things coincide, but just like a writer, I've thrown you into the plot of my presentation with a strange opening line, and now I'll go back and fill in the blanks. My thinking about my topic began last year at my junior AP English class with Ms. Pucci, and we were looking into literature on a level that I had never had before. And it reminded me of elementary school, surprisingly, where I was on the other side of that dynamic, writing creatively, which I didn't really get the chance to do anymore. This is actually one of the poems I wrote in 3rd or 4th grade. And I remembered loving the other side, which was writing, even more than I loved reading. So I came to the decision that I wanted to tackle a full-length book with Ms. Pucci as my mentor. Over the summer, I really had to think about what type of plot I wanted to work with, and I know that 2 quotes influenced me more than anything else. First was a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's my favorite author, and he said, you don't write because you want to say something, you write because you have something to say. And I thought that was really important with coming up with a theme for my book, which is really what the writing is all concentrated around. And the second quote is by a guy named David Foster Wallace, who I ironically don't know anything about. But his quote left a large impression on me. It was good fiction's job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. So my task was to try and figure out how I can reflect those 2 quotes in my plot. I first had the idea of my plot in early August, but it was something that I often thought about, even when I was younger. I always thought it was weird that you had to pay for things like electricity, water, food to survive. I thought it was strange that people had the right to do that when I was young and naive. And I thought, even when I was younger, I thought that if there was a way to capture it all, companies would have no ethical problem with selling oxygen to the general public. So that's exactly what I wrote about. From day one, I knew that my book would be called Asphyxiation and that it would concentrate around a corporation who sold oxygen to a barren, lifeless, oxygenless world. Now perhaps your lungs nearly collapsing at the beginning of my presentation makes a bit more sense. Think about that desperation, trying to breathe, and just not being able to. Now imagine trying to write about it. To say that writing a full-length book was a learning stretch would be appropriate. To say the book that I wanted to write with the craft that I wanted to incorporate was a learning stretch would be an absurd understatement. It'd kind of be like saying a tsunami was a little splash, or a missing limb was a flesh wound. I began planning immediately when I returned to school with Ms. Pucci. Those are some of the plot outlines that we came up with on her board after school. We definitely worked long and hard. I can remember staying till at least 4:30, 5 o'clock some days. And what was once a simple concept sort of developed into this grandiose vision of a future gone horribly wrong. This is a map, basically, of the setting that I developed with Ms. Pucci. It looks like it was drawn by a 3rd grader, but I'll try and explain a little bit. These circling around the edge are tanks, and people with the lowest income live here, and they have the most trouble buying oxygen. Then you have these domes from 1 till 9 going up from the tanks, and so they sort of form like an orbit, if you will. And they each have little biospheres around them that contain the only life left on Earth, and they're all oxygenated. If you were to go outside of these structures, you would asphyxiate and die. Now, as far as incorporating literary craft, my major literary craft was an allusion to Dante's Inferno. An allusion is a reference to a well-known work of poetry or fiction, what have you. And Dante's Inferno was part one of the Divine Comedy that Dante Alighieri wrote in the 1400s. So I wanted an allusion that would match the type of world I was trying to incorporate, and nothing seems more fitting than hell itself. So what I tried to do was, if you remember the domes going 1 through 9, Limbo would be Dome 1, Lustful would be Dome 2, and so on and so forth. The structure mirrors the structure of hell, but also the sinners in each ring also mirror the people in the domes and the production that they do to make this world so barren and lifeless. For example, the people in Limbo, they're not really that sinful. It's not their fault that they're there. So the people in Dome 1 produce things like insecticides, things of that nature. They're just mindlessly shipping and receiving and not really adding to the problem. Whereas, especially down in this area, the antagonist, who is supposed to represent Satan, is in Dome 9. So, as you can see, the Occupy movement started about 2 months after I came up with this idea, which is really interesting to me because I had said something that I really thought that I needed to say through this book, and apparently a lot of other people agreed with me. So in my plot, I have, in the tanks, my protagonist, Skylar Green, rebelling against the government that's suppressing him and the people. And this develops into a full-blown revolution, and it is intended to mirror this Occupy movement. It's a political statement that I further explained in my research paper. The symbolic comparison between the Occupy movement and Skylar's revolution is what I knew I wanted to write about. So I made my thesis essentially a bit of a criticism of capitalism, where, as it's underlined right there, although most economists argue capitalism allows for financial success, they do not acknowledge its accentuation of humanity's primitive animalistic traits and the resulting obstruction to human potential, which, in a lot of words, is basically saying that capitalism makes people indifferent to the problems of others. And I wanted to show our economic system through my antagonist physically and also in how he acts. So if he's indifferent to everyone else, it's not that he's evil, he's just amoral. He's indifferent to the rest of the world. However, the research paper also served as a roadblock for me. It was really time-consuming, and considering I was criticizing our economic model, that's something you don't do, I learned really quick. It was definitely hard to write and took a lot of time out of my actual book writing process. But the largest issues I had were actually while writing. I had the tendency to tell rather than show. So imagine at the beginning of this presentation, if instead of having you breathe in a couple times and essentially gasping for air, I was just like, hey, pretend you can't breathe. It doesn't really have the effects I was looking for. The other problem I had was I would slow down the action with just editorial, basically. I would show with narration what my protagonist was thinking as all of this action was happening around him, and it's just not reasonable. If you are running for your life, you're not going to be wondering about the existential conundrums facing you. And Ms. Pucci helped a lot with weeding those out. She spent a lot of time editing my papers and showing me exactly where I would tell rather than show and how I could get rid of that. I also had to read a lot. I had a lot of research to do, and that also got in the way of my writing, which is extremely difficult at this large scale. There is, even more so than writing, there is a ton of editing to do. I would say in my experience, writing was only about 25% of the work. Editing was the rest all the way. Something like this might have taken me 15 minutes if I was inspired, but the majority of time, just editing one page could have taken me anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. On one occasion, I took 2 hours to edit 2 pages. So it was very slow moving, and I wanted to make sure that I was working on enhancing the quality of my work rather than the quantity of pages. Honestly, there were times that I never wanted to write ever again. I would rather rip my hair out or asphyxiate myself rather than write about characters being asphyxiated. It's definitely not always a therapeutic art like with making music or painting, and it can be really frustrating. Hemingway once said, "There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." I could not agree with him more. However, I also think that writing is the only way to share your soul and the only way your words and thoughts can transcend death. In conclusion, this was a really valuable experience to me. I'm definitely going to bring it with me to college, where I will be majoring in writing at Ithaca College. And hopefully one day you'll see Asphyxiation published on the New York Times bestseller list, or better yet, the National Book Awards list. And if you choose to read it, I hope you'll be disturbed, because it might just comfort me to know that I've written good fiction. Thank you. I'll now open up for any questions, because I really could talk about this all day.
11.5 minutes, so perfect timing. And I'm blown away.
That's a good sign.
I will give a disclaimer. He had those political views before he took my world affairs class. I'm always fascinated by fiction writing. My question is, did you have a vision of in your flow chart there, the end of the book when you began, or did that develop over time?
That's a little harder to... I knew that I wanted some sort of confrontation between Skylar and my antagonist, Parker, because that's at the root of the problem. And I knew that it had to be in the last dome, at the end of this sort of hero's journey. And as far as the ending after that confrontation, I wasn't really sure. I know that Ms. Bushi and I traced a myth with regards to a poet who died because of a prick on a rose bush, and he got infected from it and died. And I thought that would be a really ironic way for my antagonist to die, not from any sort of direct confrontation, but from an infection from some sort of wounds he got from nature, which he destroyed. So that's really all. I haven't gotten to the end, but it's definitely something that's been in mind.